patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens, episode 33. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you so much for tuning in into this show. I hope you enjoy it and the other episodes before this one and those in the future. Just a couple of things. Again, make sure you subscribe and share this podcast if you haven't already. I really appreciate all your support. Also, check out the press tab on my website. I was featured in an episode about a week and a half ago, and it's I think just the beginning of our campaign to make sure that Friends and Fellow Citizens can be shared as much as possible. It was a great episode I did on WNCT-TV based in North Carolina. So check out that episode when you get a chance. Also, I have one more announcement. We have a Q&A that is going to be released sometime in May, but I need your help to submit the questions for that episode. Clearly, I will not be asking myself a bunch of questions because that's not super duper interactive of me. So make sure you submit your questions in by April 30th, and make sure you do that ASAP so that way you can ensure that you can get your question considered as soon as possible. All right, so today I wanted to do something a little bit more story-like. We've done a number of solo shows already, and we really like sharing these stories with all of you because it's how you engage. It's how you engage with the audience and how you engage with others. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the infrastructure proposal by President Biden. I believe it's somewhere along the lines of $2.3 trillion. I know I'm saying that just as if it's nothing, but I guess when you've got $6 trillion of COVID passed and everything over the last year, I mean, I guess $1 trillion it really is nothing. It's just like, just $1 trillion. If you stack $1 bills of $1 trillion, or I believe it's $1 bills. Yes, if you stack them all, $1 trillion is about halfway to the moon. So just to give you some context of how much $1 trillion. But anyway, regardless of that, President Biden has put out a $2.3 trillion proposal, and there's been a lot of debate about how far it goes and the costs, and just given everything that has happened, all the spending that has happened over the last couple of years, and people have said, there's a lot of pork in this, and just how there was quite a bit of pork in the previous COVID bills. There's no question about it. This is how politicians put in money, give money back to their districts in the form of these big bills. And can you really give them credit for passing COVID relief when they must? I mean, it really depends. I mean, I think there's arguments of both sides. There's one side saying that you must because of the urgency, the stimulus checks and everything. On the other side, there's the more fiscally conservative side, and they also have a very good point about making sure that you don't spend a lot. But what happens when you have a scandal of some kind where people realize that, oh my gosh, the federal government is going crazy on the spending, and a lot of that money might not be going to the projects that they claim to be funding. And that brings to what today's episode is all about. So in the midst of this infrastructure thing, again, infrastructure is not generally a very fun subject. It's not the most stimulating subject that gets people riled up. I wanted to share something a little bit more interesting. To use an example in history, I think, is to not necessarily show that, history is repeating itself. It's more about getting people engaged with history, understanding that maybe things were a little bit rougher than people think, maybe a lot rougher, depending on your judgment. Today's example is the First Transcontinental Railroad, which was constructed in the 1860s into the 1870s ish. I mean, it's kind of broadly speaking in the 1860s. In fact, the legislation that was passed to provide such funding actually occurred in the middle of the Civil War in 1863 with the passage of the Pacific Railroad Acts. And the thing about this legislation is that it really had a core principle, right, which was to encourage and promote the construction of a railroad, a transcontinental railroad that would run from essentially coast to coast. And this is definitely a lot more complicated than people think. The problem at that time was they wanted to create something huge. They wanted to connect the new state. If you think of the new state of California and all the states over there in Utah and the rest of the country, it's a massive project. But the big problem is there were so few towns. In fact, there were places where there was just nothing. Or at least there was practically no European settlement there. Think of Nebraska as an example. And this was really, really difficult for the federal government. So they felt like, okay, well, we got to come up with something here. So they came up with this idea that they were going to put in $100 million, kind of like these loans or as funding for anyone who was interested in constructing a railroad that would connect essentially California and all into the Midwest. It ended up being a little bit different, actually. It kind of ended up all the way to the Nebraska-Iowa border. But this was the proposal, and they wanted to construct this. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, the problem is no private company was interested because there were basically no one really had any business to do anything on this railroad. Again, when you don't have towns, when you don't have anything like that, you just have flat land and with basically in the middle of nowhere. I mean, who's going to be incentivized to go there and be like, oh, I'm going to make money? If their Shark Tank was around in the 1860s, I don't think this proposal would have gone down very well. I can tell you that in terms of a private proposal to construct this railroad. So what happened was that the federal government said, all right, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put in $100 million, and then we're going to have a subsidy system. And the subsidies range from, I believe, is $14,000, depending on the terrain. So if you've constructed something flat, you get less of a subsidy. But if you were daring enough, you could go into the mountains and try to build tracks there, which was obviously very hard to do. I believe it was sometime up to like $60,000 a mile or something. It's just something crazy amount of subsidies. And so there were two main railroad operators, construction, essentially doing the construction. There was Union Pacific, which was tasked in the end to construct a railroad from the Nebraska-Iowa border all the way to towards the essentially going west, and then you have the Central Pacific Railroad starting in Sacramento, starting in California, and then going east. And the plan was that these two railroads would eventually meet somewhere around the middle. Or it wasn't really the middle; it was really a competition kind of base. So whichever one could build the most, but also the fastest, was kind of going to win this race. Now, when you think of it, when you build something fast and you don't care about quality, is it really going to be quality? And what happened was that the railroads started building, and they started competing, trying to get supplies and everything. The speed thing definitely was a bit of a problem. Politicians said, we want to get this done fast. The railroads are like, all right, well, we will build it as fast as possible. But I think a lot of people then around that time were like, well, it's not going to be good quality. In fact, there were times when they actually had to build certain sections of the railroad twice because some company was, in the middle of winter, just building tracks along the ice. It doesn't work, and people had to come back in the spring and be like, oh, we got to build it again. But the railroad companies, they'd be like, well, we're getting paid by the mile, so it was such a circus in so many ways. Imagine you're building a railroad in the wilderness, and you've got threats from Native American tribes. There were some deals that were cut so that they can get more labor and ensure that people were not getting robbed or killed, because that's what the Native American tribes attempted to do many, many times. And so you had the security aspect where the U.S. government had to even step in with security guards, and There were certainly workers who, half of them were sometimes were tasked to guard the rails to make sure no one was stealing anything. And there were also other people out there trying to even get the goods to build this railroad. One example is when you think of the railroad knot. This is one of those things where you need to get lumber and you get some kind of timber. But when you're in the middle of Nebraska, you're not going to see a lot of trees there. And so what happened was that they had to build the railroads, especially Union Pacific. Union Pacific, when they were in Nebraska, they had to essentially cut the railroad through people's properties just so they can then try to see if they can cut down the trees, use the timber and everything for the rails. And it kind of became a little bit of a mess. I'm sure that anyone who had some kind of private land just all of a sudden just saw an army of railroad people just storm through your property. I don't think this was necessarily the happiest thing that ever happened to them. All right, so they're building. They're rapidly building. There's all these problems. Going back to the subsidy, remember I said that there's a subsidy for this, okay? The railroads are like, oh, this is great. We'll just build as much track as we can. So even when you look at Nebraska is very flat, as many of you know. Union Pacific thought, oh yeah, we're being paid by the mile. So you kind of saw like a bit of a serpentine track at times in Nebraska, even though there's really no reason to do so. And not to mention that Union Pacific wasn't going to be tasked like, okay, here's our routes. This is how we're going to be the most efficient. They didn't care. They just wanted the money. So they built these serpentine roads. And Central Pacific tried to doing the same thing too. I think they had a bit of more of a reason to do so because they were coming through the Sierra Nevada, through those mountainous areas. I cannot imagine how difficult it must have been. I'm sure there were accidents there that happened where trains were rolling back down hills or something, and it was crazy. And they started building. They get closer and closer and closer towards Utah. Now Utah is actually pretty lucrative because a lot of people thought that if you were to be able to maintain a lot of control of ownership of rail track in Utah, you could be able to get a lot of commerce through the Great Basin area. And so they're approaching, and as the two tracks kind of come together, they just avoid each other. And they just keep going. They just keep going. Union Pacific keeps going west, and Central Pacific keeps going east. And they just bypass each other. They never even meet. And Congress comes in, and they're like, "What's going on? You're supposed to meet." And they're like, "But we're being paid by the mile. We'll eventually get there. We just need to get around this mountain or whatever." And then finally, Congress is like, "Okay, you are meeting here." In somewhere in Utah, and eventually that was the case. I believe it was Promontory Point, Utah. The problem though is that when they were, I think this was before they were told to meet at a particular point. As they got closer, when competition gets around here, you're not always on your best attitude, and sometimes you kind of wish that the opponent wasn't really there with their progress. So at night, the railroad workers would sneak at night, and they would go to the other track, and they would blow up the tracks. They would literally do that, and then so Union Pacific did it to Central Pacific, and Central Pacific was like, "Oh, we're going to do it to you," and then they did the same thing. To Union Pacific. I can't imagine. You're sitting in Washington, you're a lawmaker, and you're getting a lot of these benefits, right? Because you're getting lobbyists from both rail companies, but then you realize that, hold on a second, there's people literally throwing rocks and blowing up tracks in Utah, and they shouldn't be doing that. So, Congress and other lawmakers were like, "No, you can't do that. No one is blowing up anything," and that's exactly. And they had to stop this violence. Finally, they were able to meet at that point, but it was it was a wild ride. And even though there were no trains going on these tracks, you could say that there were a lot of things that derailed on in this project for the First Transcontinental Railroad. So that was the crazy part. But here's something else that I want to share with all of you, and this is, I think, goes to the point of why people mistrust politicians and why politicians are incredibly shrewd people. I'm not going to say every single one is greedy. It's just not accurate. But when opportunity arises, the politicians are going to be all over it. So there's something that happened where you're thinking, okay, with all this financing, right? What is it? What is this looking like? Who's getting money? We heard the $100 million figure, right? Well, so initially money was going to be kind of allocated evenly, 50-50, right? So Union Pacific gets $50 million, Central Pacific gets $50 million. And Union Pacific, and I believe Central Pacific also had a similar idea too. The both railroad companies, you can imagine, competitors, but thought quite alike. But let's focus on Union Pacific for because this actually broke as a story. Union Pacific people thought, man, this $50 million, I don't think, since we're getting so much attention for it and there's so much work and everything, $50 million is not going to cut it. So here's what we're going to do. Union Pacific says, is basically within the network, without anyone knowing, they created a fake company called Credit Mobilier. Okay. Credit Mobilier was to be a fraudulent private company that would be touted as an independent firm that was trying their best to cut costs for the American people, trying to make this as efficient as possible, but also in a way kind of brand them as tough negotiators, because the cost was $50 million. But with this fraudulent company that they set up, they claimed to the American people and to probably to other government officials who didn't know what was going on, they told these folks saying, "Well, Credit Mobilier, man, they want $94 million for this track that we're going to lay from Nebraska all the way to wherever we're meeting in Utah." And I'll be perfectly honest with you. People will be like, $94 million, but well, they seem like a credible company. I guess it'll be $94 million. And $94 million. So guess what happened? With this fraudulent company, $44 million went all the way to the Union Pacific executives. They got all this money. They collected all this cash. They distributed it among shareholders. They had some excess money out of it. Used that excess money in the stock. And guess what they did? They gave it to the politicians. They lobbied on behalf of themselves, and they bribed a number of members of Congress in the back in those days. As I said, Central Pacific did something similar, but this one was a much bigger one, bigger deal. When the news broke out in 1872 during the election, during election campaign, the New York Sun brought up the story. People were absolutely furious. I mean, the fact that Union Pacific and Central Pacific were involved, especially Union Pacific, involved in this scandal that nearly doubled the cost. They basically lied to everybody saying that this was an independent company. It wasn't, obviously. What happened is that there basically politicians were tainted. There were people like Vice President running mate Henry Wilson. Initially said he wasn't part of it, but then he cracked. He cracked the pressure. And at the end, they identified about half a dozen members of Congress who were part of this, giving bribes, getting involved in the scandal. Only 2 were censured. And censuring obviously being a bit like a rebuke, like a public rebuke of someone. And that was the Credit Mobilier scandal, one of the biggest scandals in American history, and one that really helped define the Gilded Age, which was kind of the time period where you had a lot of economic growth, a lot of new territory that you discover, but there was a lot of corruption. And to reflect a little bit about this story, first of all, do not try this at home. Do not try to build a fraudulent railroad company and try to scam the American people, because I don't think that's going to come down very well. The FBI is not going to like that, and I would not recommend that. So, but I mean, again, the big story, the big takeaway, I think, from all this is, using American history, we try to understand as much as we can, proportionally, what circumstances were like. What was life like? Learning about the times. And when we reflect on a story like that, we obviously recognize a few things. Number one is, let's think twice about government intervention. It was a very, very tough deal. I think in those days, you certainly need some kind of government intervention. But then there's the idea of oversight. Who conducts oversight and makes sure that these huge companies, essentially a duopoly, wasn't just messing around with people and essentially stealing money from American taxpayers? There's a lot of questions about it. I hope that in this day and age, when we witness what's happening in government, whatever it is, I hope that people will think twice when a U.S. government agency claims that they're the most efficient, because let's be honest, it's not. And what that oversight is going to mean for elections is going to be a big deal. How people perceive a particular party, how people perceive a particular government, how these people hold people accountable is through elections. And I just want to bring this to light, because there are a number of things that are happening that are not pleasant at this time. But imagine if you were living in the 1860s. Maybe people at that time didn't have social media, didn't have those kinds of technologies to track what was happening. But if you were a concerned citizen, I bet that you would be pretty angry. So that's just a couple brief stories for all of you about the First Transcontinental Railroad and the credit mobilier scandal, which I think was one of the craziest. It really surprises me how people didn't notice what was happening, but that's politics. Not trying to look for everything that happens. Some things are obvious, some things are not. But I hope that this was enjoyable for you. Again, make sure you subscribe and share this podcast if you haven't already. I really appreciate you listening to this episode today. I hope you will check out the other episodes we have, the other 32 episodes that I've put out already. And I hope that you will stay tuned and continue our journey as we have a lot more content for all of you coming for this year, rest of this year, and beyond. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you next time at the next episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens. Take care, and so long.